I can't even say in German. Guten Abend.
Guten Abend.
And the only thing we still need is Steffi Richter. Is she in the room? The only person we still need is Steffi Richter. And then we can really start. We are starting a bit late because of the reception downstairs, but that is not a problem because I hope you have had the time to have a good dish. And we are going to make sure everybody feels at ease, that you've had something to drink and to eat. And then we have a session this afternoon, this evening, which will take us for about 1.5 hours. So we'll make it interactive. And we're going to speak in English. So if anybody needs an other language, we don't have translation, but the only thing we could maybe help with is whisper translation. So let us know if you need any support. And you send her a message?
Yeah, I email.
Super, perfect. So my name is Sasha Gabizon, and I am with Women Engaged for a Common Future. And we are co-organizing this side event this evening on gender toxics and the right to a clean, safe, healthy, and sustainable environment. And it's a great honor to co-organize this event together with IPEN, who you all know, of course, as well as the Geneva Environmental what are you called? Network.
Yeah.
Environmental Network. Yeah. And so we think this is one of the very important topics of this week. As you all know, the BRS Conventions have been working on gender. They have a gender strategy since 2013. And we have been doing also a lot of work together with the BRS, and we see that indeed we need to have different perspectives when we look for policy solutions on the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions and their implementation. And here at the table, we have amazing speakers who will bring their different perspectives and knowledge. And we'll have a dialogue with you on learning from how things are happening in other countries. I know Mexico would like to also say something later on. And some and others as well. I know who are in the room. Yeah, let me just say thank you very much to all the speakers for joining us. We have with us, of course, not Rolf himself, but his colleague David, who will stand in for him because Rolf is still being kept at another important meeting downstairs. But thank you, David, for joining us. We have Steffi Richter from Germany joining us. Thank you very much. We have Marcus Orellana, around which we have built this event, because Marcus is an expert on human rights and toxics and has done a specific, very important study on gender dimensions. We have Griffin Socheng, who is an amazing expert from Kenya, Africa, and whom has been doing with us a lot of work and with IPEN on gender dimensions of chemicals and waste. We have with us Sonja Hoeftheim, who is a wonderful expert from Indonesia, from the Nexus Foundation. And next to her, we have the two colleagues from ILO, Hauska and Clarissa, who are going to look also at the occupational dimensions and gender dimensions. So thank you very much to our panelists to be here tonight. We are being streamed, so we're being filmed. If there's any problems with that, please let us know. We'll also take some pictures. If you don't want to be in a picture, let us know. Yeah, we will be sharing also the report and the slides, of course, of this meeting. Now, let's see if everybody's in the room and if we are ready to start. Maybe just a feeling to see who is here. How many of you are representing member states, parties? Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much for spending your evening with us. I hope you don't have to rush off to a contact group. How many of you are representing civil society and human rights organizations? Wonderful, wonderful. And how many of you are representing youth organizations? Anyone? Yeah, what a youth delegation. That's great. Do we have any, UN agencies or organizations here as well? Great, 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 super. Well, that's very nice. Thank you for coming. Now let's start right away so we don't end too late. And I'm going to ask right away David to give us an introduction speech for today's session.
Well, thank you. Yes, Rolf could not make it, so my name is David Ogden, and I'm the Deputy Executive Secretary for the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions. Distinguished colleagues, friends, and partners, good evening and welcome to this important side event co-organized by IPEN, Women Engaged for a Common Future, and the Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights. It's an honor to open today's discussion on a topic that lies at the very heart of sustainable development and human rights. That is the intersection of gender, hazardous chemicals, and the right to a healthy environment. The Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention have a long history have recognized the gender differentiated impacts of chemicals and waste. Since 2013, we have worked to embed gender equality in the core of our operations through the BRS Gender Action Plan. In fact, Susan Wainfield here is our coordinator and the author of the plan. Today, I'm pleased to highlight that a new and ambitious draft gender action plan for the next 10 years, 2025 to 2035, has been submitted for consideration of the Conference of the Parties this week. The new plan reflects a decade of lessons learned. It builds on our experience in gender responsive programming, policy, and training, and it incorporates input from parties, civil society, and experts. It emphasizes inclusive engagement, supports national gender mainstreaming in chemicals and waste management, and promotes gender balanced leadership. It also underscores the importance of robust gender disaggregated data and cross-cutting partnership. This is key to evidence-based and equitable decision-making. Our work is driven by the recognition that women, girls, and certain communities face unique vulnerabilities to toxic impacts of pollution. The evidence is clear. Hazardous chemicals contribute to infertility, miscarriages, cancers, and other human harms that disproportionately affect these groups. Right to a clean, safe, and healthy environment must be realized for all, not just a few. The event offers a timely space to explore the findings of the Special Rapporteur's report on toxics and human rights, to hear from government leaders, technical experts, and civil society, and to elevate gender perspectives that are all too often overlooked in the chemicals and waste governance. Let us leave here today with a renewed resolve to ensure that implementation of the BRS Convention contributes meaningfully gender equality into a future where no one is left behind in protection of their health, dignity, and environment. Thank you once again for joining us, and I look forward to an insightful discussion ahead. Thank you.
Rich David. And I'm really impressed at the work which is being done by you and your colleagues, including Susan, who has to leave us now. Are there any questions for David at this moment? Yes, we have a question over here. Please introduce yourself. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Oleg. I'm from the delegation of the Russian Federation. I would like to ask David if you might estimate the amount, the percentage of resources for mainstreaming gender perspective in the operational activities of BRS Convention on the overall resource management of the convention. Because yes, you said very important issue, and what is the percentage approximately?
Yeah, I don't know the exact percentage, and maybe Susan has a better idea, but it really is embedded to all of our activities. We have like a gender indicator for the various areas of the program of work, and so it's sort of hard to separate, but Susan, do you have any sort of estimated?
Well, it's a good question. To be honest, at the moment, well, there are two ways in which gender is funded through the conventions. That's part of our core activities, as David indicates, and it is hard to separate out from our core budget because we really do bring it through. It's a common thread through all of the programmatic activities of the Secretariat, but we also have voluntary funds. For example, we work with Sasha and her team. We're working at the moment on a gender and plastic waste management project in Africa, in Zambia and Rwanda. So those are additional funds that we receive from our donors. We report on that through our budget and program of work. But yeah, we're always looking for donors to support further work on gender.
Thank you very much for that question and for the interest in this work. One more question and then we continue. Yes, please introduce yourself.
I'm John from Kenya. We work closely with
John.
Philippines.
Please speak louder. The colleague from
Yeah.
Kenya. Yes.
My question, I know it's a bit controversial. Why is it that gender is only associated with women? Yeah, because I'm always championing this back at home, and when I try to encourage our ladies to get into this subject, it's like you are trying to demean us. Yeah, so it's actually counter-reactive. So I'm wondering, why is it only associated with women?
That's a fair question. But I would have to say, but if you look at, for example, the Secretariat of BRS, we're much more women than men. I think you'd find you get a lot of value out of those employees. They're very, very, very good employees. So actually, we when we hire within BRS, we don't even have to worry about trying to balance because we just get a lot of good women candidates. But I know it's not true everywhere. So sometimes you need to emphasize women and girls, and so that you can more balance things, because it's not. I understand that's the way it is in the world. So it's sort of overcoming an imbalance at this point. And then hopefully after a while, it won't be talking so much about women and girls because it will be much more balanced.
That is the aim.
That is
Gender equality. But I think it fits, the question is very good and it fits very well with the motto of this week, make the invisible visible. Because often we lack data. We haven't been able to see the full data on how women and men are differently impacted, etc. So that will be part of the discussion today because this is certainly about all genders. So not only about women. Thank you very much for that question. And David, thank you very much. I know you have maybe other things to do, so stay as long as you like, but leave whenever you need to leave.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Then I have the great pleasure to ask Steffi Richter for a short introduction as well. Thank you, Steffi.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Thank you, all of you being here. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, distinguished colleagues, to be with me. I was asked to tell something on how Germany is committed to the gender issue, and Germany is committing to ensure gender responsive chemical regulation. We try that both at the domestic and international levels. I'm from the Federal Ministry of Environment, and we try to play a key role in these efforts. At the domestic level, Germany has integrated gender equality consideration into its chemicals management policies. For example, the German Chemicals Act requires risk assessments for chemical substances, taking into account potential differences in exposure and between men and women. The German Ordinance on Hazardous Substances also includes provisions for protecting workers, including pregnant women and women of childbearing age, from exposure to hazardous chemicals. To assess gender impacts, the ministry uses various tools and try to implement them throughout the framework, such as the gender impact assessment. This is a tool where the ministry conducts such an assessment to identify potential gender specific impacts of policies, laws, and programs. The gender impact assessment helps the ministry to ensure that gender equality considerations are integrated into the development and implementation of chemicals regulation. We have the gender mainstreaming, promote gender mainstreaming in the policies, programs, and activities related to chemicals management. This approach involves considering the different needs, priorities, and experiences of women and men in all stages of the policy cycle. And we are engaged in engaging stakeholders. The ministry engages with various stakeholders, including women's organizations, to ensure that gender equality considerations are integrated into chemicals management policies. This engagement helps the ministry to understand the diverse perspectives and experiences of women and men in relation to chemicals exposure and risks. At the international level, Germany is actively engaged in promoting gender responsive chemicals regulations through various forums, for instance, in UNEP, working with UNEP and the OECD, and in the new global framework on chemicals, which was finalized in September 2023 in Bonn. We are especially engaged in this. Germany supports the inclusion of gender equality considerations in international chemicals management policies and initiatives and promotes the exchange of best practices and experiences in this area. We think good examples have a specific role to show where gender aspects could be implemented and could help to implement sustainable policies. In conclusion, ministry uses various tools and frameworks to ensure gender responsive chemicals regulation, both domestically and through international cooperation. Nevertheless, the consideration of gender aspects is not yet ideal in Germany. We are not on the end. In addition to the successes mentioned above, we must also recognize that there is still some catching up to do, especially at a time when the economic considerations are critical. We must recognize that gender aspects are often put aside in favor of economic considerations. But that does not mean we have to give up. It must be made clear that damage caused by chemicals also creating economic costs. This means that taking vulnerable population groups into account, including women and children and so on, is also worthwhile and represent a way to limit damages. We must also work with economic arguments to clarify why we must consider gender aspects. And that is the way we are go ahead and try to act. Yeah, thank you very much. I hope that.
Stefan Richter, and thank you for explaining also how this is integrated into your policies very concretely. And so I think, there's a lot we can learn from different countries and what has been happening. I know that Griffins will also tell us a little bit how it's integrated into policies in Kenya, for example. So there's very, very many good practices. So we have an empty chair in the middle in case one of the colleagues from ILO would like to move inwards, for example. Maybe Clarissa, you can just sit next to Griffins if you want. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, you want to stay there? Okay, that's also fine. Yes, Diana. Marcos, you can sit in the middle. Yes, let's do that. Here we go. Very, very good idea. You can see that. Yeah, thanks. That's perfect. Perfect for the photos. Well, so now it's my great, great honor to introduce Marcos Orellana, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, and who has been working these last years on several very important reports. And last year you presented your report on gender and toxics and chemicals, and specifically looking at this right to a healthy and sustainable environment. And like to hear more about that and see how we can maybe use this when we are looking at policies and the implementation of the BRS conventions in our countries. So the floor is yours, Marcos.
Thank you so much, Sasha. I'm very pleased to have the chance to be with you this evening. As you mentioned, Sasha, my name is Marcos Orellana. I'm the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights. This is a special procedure of the UN Human Rights Council that has been created in the understanding that exposure to hazardous substances or wastes can lead to a range of negative implications for the effective enjoyment of human rights. One of the tools that special procedures use to carry out our monitoring and reporting tasks is to prepare thematic reports. And as you mentioned, Sasha, last year I had the opportunity to present a thematic report on gender and toxics to the UN General Assembly in October. On the sides of that, I was also quite pleased to organize and co-organize with the German mission in New York a side event, also convened by human rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the Center for Reproductive Rights. And we also held a similar event like this one at the UN Commission on the Status of Women earlier this year. And so we're trying to disseminate the key findings of this thematic report. Some of those key findings include the following. This will not come as a surprise. We as humanity are confronting a global toxic crisis where some people can live healthy lives, reproduce, and bring healthy newborns to the world, and others cannot. And that is a fundamental environmental injustice and reproductive injustice. In approaching this problematic and reflecting on the question by the gentleman from Kenya in a moment, the working assumption for this report was to focus on toxics and women and girls. And soon after initial consultations and comments received, it was pointed out that the issue did not concern only women and girls. Women and girls are disproportionately impacted by the adverse effects of chemicals and waste. There are some practices and some chemicals that affect men and boys in a differentiated manner as well. And so as socially constructed categories, gender as a socially constructed categories became the conceptual point of reference for the elaboration of this report. But that said, the impacts are disproportionately felt by women and girls, and a big part of that is because of physiology, and that's where issues of endocrine disrupting chemicals come into play. So these are chemicals, many of you may be familiar with them, that mimic estrogen and thus have wide-ranging impacts on all functions of the female body. An example are phthalates included or added to plastics to make them more flexible. So they're called everywhere chemicals because pretty much they're everywhere. That's pretty straightforward. That means, among other things, that the failure to control plastic pollution is a symptom of environmental violence against women. But it's not only physiology that explains the disproportionate impacts. It is also discrimination in society. And this is where the socially constructed categories concept also come into play. So opportunities to influence decision-making or participate in decision-making processes is a big element of that. And also the pressures of the stereotypes created around certain forms of understandings of beauty and pressures of advertising. An example of that is the use of mercury in skin lightening creams, so called for women to look whiter, and that in order to access certain opportunities in the workplace or certain educational opportunities. And so all of that is an element of discrimination. As David, who just left, mentioned, some of the impacts are quite severe. Infertility, miscarriages, certain forms of terminal illnesses such as breast and cervical cancer. So all of this implicates reproductive justice. All of this implicates intergenerational equity, and all of this implicates environmental injustices. In addition to documenting all of this, which I'm laying at a very general level of abstraction, the report gets at analysis of intersectionality. So concurring causes of vulnerabilities, and one of them is poverty. The ability to have educational opportunities, so literacy, and so the opportunity to read and understand what labels may say or take measures to protect themselves or a family. The iron stores in the body that would otherwise provide certain levels of protection against heavy metals exposure, or the location of residence. Many people live in sacrifice zones proliferating around the world. These are areas so polluted where a life of dignity is not possible, where the environment and its inhabitants are sacrificed for the benefit often of economic development. An example there of crisis and situation in Bhopal, India, last year, commemoration of many years of community struggling for environmental justice, where countless women suffering from infertility. Point I wish to highlight not only the physical dimension, but also the stigma associated to that. Many women unable or stigmatized, and so not suitable for marriage in the eyes of the communities, in the eyes of prevailing power structures. This kind of, I'll come back to this stigmatization issue in a minute. Since we have representatives from ILO, I won't elaborate too much on the workplace, but I do want to mention a couple sectors that are identified in the report, electronics being one of them. Women and girls working in the fields, especially in the global south, documentation of countries where up to 70% of the labor force in the fields are women and girls exposed to highly hazardous pesticides, many of which are being exported by countries in the industrialized world that have banned them for use in their own territories. So issues of double standards there. It's not only in developing countries, however, in the industrialized north, we also see impacts disproportionate on women and girls in the farming, in the agricultural sector, especially migrant women. Waste pickers, so the waste management sector is another big area. So some occupations being regarded as feminine. Cleaning is one of them, and so the exposure to cleaning products, again, disproportionate impacts. During the consultations, and according to the information received, mercury and the impacts of indigenous peoples of small-scale gold mining was also highlighted. So this back to the issue of stigma and stigmatization. Women that were unable to bear children in certain indigenous communities being expelled from their communities because of the blame. And so these intersectionalities. Approaches. What kind of approaches are we having to these problems? Well, approaches are largely fragmented, and they're largely based on notions of risk, trying to assess risk. Now, assessing risk requires a lot of data and a lot of capacity, which is lacking in most of the world. And often risk is assessed by reference to a middle-aged male. And so that creates discrepancies again and injustices. Opportunities to move forward. David spoke about the Gender Action Plan in BRS. We're seeing similar initiatives elsewhere. Framework on Chemicals is looking at this. There's initiatives in the Escazú Agreement in Latin America and the Caribbean. But there's certainly a need for disaggregated data and then for prevention based on that data. It's not just knowing things, it's acting on the data. So in conclusion, the global recognition by the UN General Assembly of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a landmark moment in, I will say, our human understanding of our interconnection with nature and also interconnection between in societies. And so that means that differentiated impacts need to be addressed in a differentiated manner. Thank you so much for your attention. Have a good day.
Wow, what you can explain in 10 minutes is just amazing, Marcos. Thank you very, very much for that summary of your amazing report. And yes, I would like to see if there are any immediate questions for Marcos. Of course, later we will still have a question, but any questions on comprehension, scope? Yes, I see it. Our colleague from Kenya, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm keen about the gender action policy. How did you incorporate the gender aspects within the chemicals policy in Germany? And then I'm also looking at this report. It's I always hear about special rapporteur reports. What's the importance of these reports? Yeah, I'm just trying to look at how it can feed into our system because they really have a very significant and quite emotive, information such that the policy makers really requires a very good, I don't know, you really need to have a good basis to.
Thank you. Yes, can this be a good basis for policy improvements? Thank you very much for the question. Any other comments? Yes, the colleague over here. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. I am Ram Charitrasal, representing an NGO called Center for Public Health and Environmental Development, CPED, Nepal. Listening with the two presentation, one has a very specific legal framework addressing the gender issue in the country specific, and another Marcus sir has brought very diverse issue of chemical impact on different gender, different even age group in different setting. Having said that, we also know that European Union, including Germany, have number of pesticide banned for their own consumption. But they are sending this, producing and sending the toxic chemicals, which is toxic to them, and therefore it is banned. And how come it is non-toxic to Asian and African, where this case studies has been come up with? So I didn't see any coherence between her speech and Marcus sir finding how we can prevent those kind of things happening by curtailing those kind of double standard. Toxic for one people is non-toxic for another. So can we prevent that kind of thing?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. So maybe we can indeed use the results of Marcos also to help still improve things in Germany and Europe. So I think these are the two questions. I would like to maybe would you like to answer?
Thank you very much for that question. I think you putting your finger on a wound. It is we are really discussing on that issue in Germany. The European Union announced that they wanted to develop a legislation on an export ban on hazardous pesticides, and we discussed on that very much. on one hand, it could not be that in European Union and in Germany, we do not use specific pesticides because they are toxic in our environment and for our human health. And we are producing that and exporting it to other countries, and we say that is not the case. It cannot be. Otherwise, we were reported and from countries that they need specific pesticide under their
And thank you for bringing this up, Ram. And let's go to Martels, if you have any points.
Sure. Thank you, Sasha. Thank you for the question. So on the point about double standards and the export of banned pesticides, for short, if we recall that the European Union issued or released a strategy for sustainability where it pledged to put an end to this odious practice. Now, one thing is to make a promise and a pledge. Another is to adopt an actual legal measure, such as a regulation that will put an end to this. So in the debate, touch upon a couple arguments. One is on mirroring the business and human rights debate. The responsibility of states to control their territories and to control companies domiciled in them, especially when their activities may have foreseeable adverse impacts abroad. Now, the impacts here are documented, and so it's not just foreseeability. These impacts are quite well documented. And so there is influence, and so based on that understanding of the evolution of human rights law and respect of business activity, there is a solid basis for the countries of origin to take action. But it is sometimes said that, well, it is the countries of import that have a sovereign right to determine what enters their territory. And that is true as far as that goes. But it is a disingenuous argument in that for many developing countries, and this is also part of the monitoring and reporting tasks of my mandate, I can document lack of capacities, the lack of real abilities of authorities to have access to the relevant information, not to go into issues of corruption or corporate capture of the state institutions. And so that's why I think rightly so, the Rotterdam Convention speaks about shared responsibilities. of exporting countries and of importing countries, but those shared responsibilities break down if the science policy interface platform breaks down, which is what's happened in Rotterdam. So all that for on the point of the double standards, and on the point of the reports of special procedure mandate holders or special rapporteurs. They serve a documentation function, so that's bread and butter for human rights work. That used to be a pre-vegan metaphor, by the way. Maybe it needs to be changed now. But in any event, I think you understand what it means. It's human rights work of documenting abuses, violations, of analysis and producing recommendations so that governments can consider them in strengthening their institutional approaches to the problems that I've identified. But more pointedly, what's the value of a report? The value is what you do with it, basically. And so I put it back to you for homework of taking the report and running with it and making the most that you can with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcos and Steffi, for your answers. And you can stay with us. If you need to leave, you can leave as well. But we hope you will stay till the further discussions, and we will continue. We have still wonderful presentations, and I need to check who is next on my list. It's Sonja.
Yes.
So Sonja Boefthuizen, Senior Program Officer from Nexus 3 Foundation and co-chair of the IPAN Youth Group. And, the floor is yours. I think you have slides.
Yeah, thank you very, yeah, I have slides. Yes, like, yes.
Perfect. Let's go.
Yeah, good afternoon, good evening. Sasha, after Marco's speech, I feel less chemist. I have a chemistry background, but all the chemical aspect already been covered very well by Marcos. So now maybe it's more about the rights than, so everyone, I'm Sonia Boefthuizen, like what Sasha already mentioned, that such an honor for me to be here among all the experts and committed advocates. So for this time, I'll be sharing about the frontline perspective from young people, from women, and from communities at the heart of the toxic injustice in the global south. I'm from Indonesia. So this is not the story of harm. This is a story of resilience and leadership as well. Next slide. Oh, I can use it. Yeah. So maybe just a brief one. So it's about Nexus 3 Foundation. I represent Nexus 3 Foundation. This is maybe different name here. It's like our name under the UNEP. So it's based in Indonesia. We are the IPAN participating organization. We have worked for over 2 decades to protect vulnerable groups, the population from environmental harm, especially from toxic chemicals and pollution. We promote a just toxics-free and sustainable future. Research, advocacy, and also the community-based action, often alongside youth, women, and grassroots leaders who close to the impacts. And alongside with my work, I'm also part of the IPAN Youth and Chemical Initiative. So IPAN is a global network over more than 100 to 120 countries, more than 600 NGOs and CSOs, civil society organization. We're working toward a world where no one is harmed by the production, use, and disposal of toxic chemicals. Then IPAN Youth is a caucus under the IPAN. It was created to engage young people and youth-led organizations, especially from the global south, and to empower them, to empower me as the agents of change in our communities and the global stage as well. It's a space for young people, young voice, not only heard, but uplifted. I feel it in IPAN. So it's a space for learning for us, organizing and building solidarity across border and generation to demand environmental justice and intergeneration equity. Since I'm not really familiar with this one. So yeah. I'm so sorry.
The other way.
Technical things. Okay. Yeah. This is the I really like the title, The Invisible, the Unequal. The reality is exposure to hazardous chemicals is not equally distributed. So women, youth, gender diverse people often bear the heaviest toxic burdens, yet their voices remain underrepresented in the research, regulation, and also the global decisions. In many parts of the global south, especially in highly patriarchal societies, the invisibility is even worse. In Indonesia, and I believe in many countries, in developing countries, poor countries, women play crucial and irreplaceable roles in the community, health, agriculture, and local advocacy. Yet too often, their voice, our voice, my voice, are dismissed simply because I'm a woman. They are women. I'm young. They are young, or come from marginalized groups. So this must change. So this is not just about gender on age alone. It's about intersectional of identity, being a woman, being young, being indigenous, being a worker, being from a rural and marginalized community. These overlapping identities often compound the risks people face and compound the exclusion they experience. So recognizing intersection is essential for me, myself, I think, if we truly want to address environmental injustice and chemical harms. Okay. I will share our works from the front lines. On the ground, Next Tree Foundation monitors pollutants, raises public awareness, and advocate for not just environmental program, but a human rights issue as well. We defend children health, promote environmental justice, and expose how toxic exposure is not just environmental program, it's a human rights issue. Most importantly, we empower women and youth, not just as a victim, not just a object, but as a watchdogs, educators, and agents of change as well. So empowering them, however, it's not always easy. It's super hard, especially if you go to like the rural area, like second tier cities and so on. In patriarchal contexts, their crucial contribution is often minimized. So we know without leadership, lasting solutions are possible without the woman leadership. So this is from the weeks to the right. So exposure to hazardous chemicals is not only environmental issue, it's a human rights issue. I remember I attended the yesterday side event. One of the delegation, he gave a really, the statements hit me. So it's from Mr. Santos from Angola for the Ministry of Environment Angola. So he emphasized during yesterday's side event in many parts of the global south, people very often think the connect chemical poisoning with human rights violence because the idea itself can feel distant, like inaccessible and unimaginable. So people really hard to connect between human rights and the chemical impact. I'm not talk about the people in the developed countries, but in developing countries, it's kind of hard. If you talk about the human rights, it's another thing. There's a bridge between chemicals pollution and the human rights. So the impacts are very real, like what Marcos mentioned before, the infertility, miscarriage, cancer, development disorder, and serious mental and physical harm. So these effects strike at the core of our rights, the right of health, the right of body autonomy, the right to safe work, the right to clean and healthy environment. Like what you see that on my slide, it's in Bahasa, but it means like, Mr. President, I want clean air. It's just like a really basic. So this girl, she has several problems with the lung. Yeah, so recognition is no longer enough. We need accountability. So right must be backed by strong, enforceable mechanism that deliver protection, justice, and redress. So across the world, youth are not waiting for permission. So we are collecting data, mobilizing communities. We have the Children Youth Major Group here. They have a lot of expertise on that side. So educating our peers as well and speaking out. We are scientists, we are organizers, we are educators, and sometimes we are the only ones sounding the alarm in neglected places. So however, we must move beyond symbolic involvement. Too often, youth are invited to meeting just to tick the box. Or we have this representative there, we have the youth at the corner, and so on and so on. To show that the youth are included, but without giving us really influence over outcomes. So we don't want the visibility without voice. So we don't want a seat only at the table without the power to shape the decisions. We demand a meaningful power sharing, genuine collaboration, and long-term support, not just photo opportunities like, oh, there's a youth there, it's nice to have them, blah, blah, blah. I'm not sorry, but this happens sometimes. So this is our call of the actions. So what do we call for? So I speak on behalf of the youth. So first, gender and youth equality must be embedded in all political policies, process, and frameworks under the BRS Convention and beyond. The second, frontline community-led solution must be recognized and financially supported, especially those driven by women and youth in the global south. The third, youth must be meaningfully involved in decision-making from the very beginning, not consulted after decisions have already been made. And the fourth, policies must be grounded in the real-life experiences, not just technical assumption of theory. I know it's very hard to get do the sampling and so on, but I think like we need the kind of base activity. Then, and across all of this, we must recognize the intersectionality, ensuring the solution reflected the complex realities faced by those living a multiple overlapping region of society. At the same time, I want to recognize the appreciate the positive steps already happening. So UNEP, for example, has increasingly created space for youth participation, like the Children Youth Major Group here, and organizations like IPAN have truly embraced equality. So where no senior experts hesitate to share their knowledge to the younger generation, like what I face right now. I'm personally very grateful to be part of the Secretariat Foundation IPAN network, where I have the opportunity to learn, to grow, and connect with inspiring allies like WECF here, and other many organizations that across the world. So the spirit of openness and mentorship is what gives us hope, which gives me hopes, and it shows that real change is possible when we work together. So yeah, maybe it's to us. Yeah, we are exposed to hazardous chemicals, to injustice, and the consequences of decisions we need not make. We are engaged, not just as participants, but as a researcher, advocates, organizer, and leaders within our communities. Then we are empowered. We are empowered, not because power has handed to us, but because we have claimed our voices, our spaces, and our right to shape the future. And we are not afterthoughts. We are already leading change on the ground, often with very few resources, but with enormous commitment. So yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to share our experience, my experience, and to represent the voice of those who are too often left behind in these global conversations. Let's continue work together for a future that is just toxic-free and truly inclusive for all. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sonia. What a leadership, youth leadership. We're so happy to have you here and your colleagues from the major group of the children and youth. This is really, I think, a very important message, and I liked your slogan, from risk to rights. So we will need to use that more.
Copyright.
Fits very well with the presentation of Marcus's report. And of course, we'll be happy to also make your slides available for everybody. Are there any questions for Sonia? If not, we go.
Good.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah. I am Sheikh Sila from Sierra Leone. So under one of the frontline activities is monitoring. So I just want to know which type of particular pollutants you monitor, and maybe the source of data.
Super, thank you. So the colleague from Sierra Leone. Ask about sure.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, well, Nexus 3 already been work for 2 decades. We monitor mercury in particular, lead in paint, mercury in all sectors, artisanal scale gold mining, dental amalgam, the cosmetics like Marcos mentioned before. And the other part, we work on the toxic chemicals in plastic as well. So we will do the advocacy as well as taking the sample. So we monitor every chemicals like what I mentioned. So it's like a being work together with IPAN and ADVENT network.
Yeah, and I think that has been very eye-opening for many people, right? To find out the toxic chemicals they then find in these tests. Yeah. So thank you for that. And you can, of course, discuss more later, because I think indeed using testing and monitoring of pollution is often what we really need to change people's minds, also of decision makers, of course. Yeah. Great. Then without further ado, we continue to Griffins Ocheng, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Environmental Justice and Development in Kenya, and a longtime partner of both IPAN and WCF on these issues of understanding the gender dimensions of the implementation of the BRS Conventions in countries like Kenya. So the floor is yours. And we have, I think, Diana in charge of the slides. Your colleague in charge of the slides.
It's okay.
Yeah.
All is there. Wonderful. Wonderful. Ready to go.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I think this is a presentation on the examples, particularly on a case study that was done, I think 2023, that informed the development of the Gender Action Plan that can inform parties on how they can develop their policies to match or to implement what has been presented in terms of the dimension of gender, particularly on chemicals and waste policies. So in terms of the work to undertake this case study, looked at context, situational analysis in country. So we have a video that was also undertaken as part of that, and also looking at some of the case examples or case stories in terms of alternatives to the toxic chemicals and how particularly different gender, male, female, implement some of these solutions, and basically looking at the chemicals like toxic pesticides, as well as in the waste management sector. But before that, just a snapshot of CEJAD, or how we call ourselves, Center for Environment, Justice and Development. It's a participating organization of IPAN, and we've partnered with WCF in this case story. Our main goal is a just and sustainable society for free of toxic chemicals. And we work to promote sound chemicals management with evidence-based research to inform policy, but also empowerment of communities or those affected by chemicals in terms of knowledge, but also alternative solutions that they can implement to prevent and protect themselves. So this is the video I mentioned, and you can watch it if you, I think we were meant to play it.
Yeah, I think everything is set for us to see 1 minute of this video.
So Dandora dam site being a place where waste is dumped. In this country, there is no segregation of waste into organic, into plastic and other form of waste.
Now life here is hard. And this leg, this vein pains a lot. If you go to the hospital, they did an X-ray, they told me, they give me 2 painkillers. Even you can find here some women bleeding, overbleeding when their monthly period comes. It goes even 2 months. It can, even me, I developed that bleeding problem. You think if you go to hospital, you've been told that it is hormonal imbalance. They send you to gynecologist. You can't afford that money.
For the West Speaker, Winfred, the situation that she faces would be linked to many other factors because we have a cocktail of chemicals released as a result of the practices that are happening in the dam site, either through inhalation because of the fumes or through ingestion because of the food that they are exposed to, they eat, because they definitely eat chicken, they eat eggs from the nearby area. and also the water that perhaps they are drinking from the nearby sources of river or water sources. And as a result of that, this may be linked to the situation that she has, whereby, as I said, this class of chemicals, it can be heavy metal or the POPs, has different kind of effects on human health.
Thank you so much. So before I go into the policy scenario, when we're looking at this case study, I think this video has spoken to what we've talked about. So it's basically to understand from evidence, because we had a lot of literature on how the toxic chemicals impact us differently. And that can inform how we make policies that respond to that kind of context. So that video is basically to provide the context analysis. And it's not just on the challenges in terms of the toxic chemicals, but there are also other, in the video, positive solutions on how women-led in innovations, engagement, for instance, in using, for instance, making biogas from waste that can prevent that exposure, because we are also going to hear from, how based on the different exposure we are impacted. So there's also been a lot of positive in terms of change, because in Kenya's constitution, the issue of gender is been very much mainstreamed. Our constitution provides for equal participation, 2/3 gender rule actually, and it has also acceded to the Convention on elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. There's a state department that is in charge of gender. There's even a commission that is to look at the aspect of implementation of gender. But as Sonia put it, issues of human rights are, of course, not been looked at from the chemicals and waste. This is one of the program areas within the environmental, frameworks within the UN that has low political, kind of visibility. Simply because, I don't know, because it's technical, there are few, but the youth organizations like SEJAD are bringing this to the policy arena that we can have to look at this at different level. The Constitution itself has a right to a clean and healthy environment. So the people we've seen in the video deserve to work in a clean and healthy environment. And the waste speakers that you've seen, our organization has worked to ensure that they can be able to have a collective voice, that they can be able to speak for themselves on issues or challenges, and they can be at the decision-making table. So it's not an NGO speaking on that for them, but they are able to be on the table to speak for the issues that they see, and that can inform the policy implementation. And so this has evolved. Like in 2022, we had a new law that was enacted that promotes what we call from linear to circular economy, that embeds the issue of waste hierarchy, from waste reduction to segregation, and recycling and other forms are at the end of the hierarchy. So it's very important because it provides for material recovery in terms of reducing dumping that we've seen. So in the end, hopefully in the future, we'll have reduced illegal dumps as well as such a dump site that you've seen, because there will be more material recovery facilities that are devolved, because Kenya has a devolved function of government where we have counties. So this will be basically implemented by the county governments. And this, you can see opportunities where women, men can have equal rights to participate in this material recovery, and that will reduce the exposure. It has also enacted extended producer responsibility regulations that has formed what we call producer responsible organization that can also engage with waste speakers, for instance, where we saw a lot of women, particularly in the dump sites, in terms of how they can be able to take responsibility for the produce and the products. So that requires bargaining, whereby there is equal compensation for even for waste speakers. In terms of policy, there's a lot of progressive approaches that has come up in terms of the implementation. And that's where we are also trying to work with our policymakers, our government, John, who is there, in terms of how do we enhance this. And I also see that in terms of programs, it's great that through the implementation of the Gender Action Plan, there is a requirement in projects and programs that governments implement. We participate in development as stakeholders of some of those programs. And we try and emphasize from the context analysis, the video, to ensure that even in our implementation of the program, it's not just taking the box, how many women participated in this workshop, how many men, but looking at in terms of if it's analysis, monitoring, how do we ensure that it addresses the invisible impacts that we are talking about, even in terms of the theme of this conference. So I will move fast. So in terms of what this study aimed to do was to look at how men and women are differently impacted. And as I said, that was backed up with literature in terms of studies, because these are toxic chemicals, in terms of waste management, how they are exposed, but also the occupations and roles. So we look at in the pesticide and the farming sector, in the artisanal and small scale gold mining, we were involved in negotiation of Minamata Convention. And my experience in the gold mining sector, I will not even go there. There's ways in terms of roles that women and men play. There are those hard roles when you go into the shaft, you want to dig the rocks. So they traditionally find that men are the ones involved. But where do we add the toxic chemicals? It's at the processing where those mercury now are exposed. So these are challenges that has to be understood for our policy to respond to those kind of, in terms of occupations, and of course the best practices. So I'll move quickly. These are some of the practices that we identified that were positive. Of course, we were looking at it from aspects of also environmental sound management. We find that in waste management, you find people making poles, maybe from plastic, which means there are some thermal process, which we are discouraged because the Basel Convention, for instance, has technical guidelines on what is environmentally sound. So in this, we also find that there's low understanding in terms of the innovation. So how do we change that so that they don't solve one problem by creating another problem, which is not visible? And that's what we are talking about in terms of the impact. The next slide. And so these are some of the pictures you could see, for instance, utensils. We've looked at, for instance, in our monitoring, those utensils from black plastics that we found a lot of toxic chemicals that are banned in the Stockholm Convention. So these kind of innovations will help reduce. Of course, we'll have the forestry sector that we say we are cutting down all the trees, but it's better to have some positive solutions that reduces the toxic chemicals. So this is a very important holistic approach that need to be taken. And as you will see, as you go forward, next slide, the recommendation is having a multi-sectoral and multifaceted approach. Now we are talking about the triple planetary crisis. We has advocated for involvement of the biodiversity sector, the climate change sector in the discussions at national level when it comes to issues of chemicals. Similarly, the chemical sector will be able to participate in discussions around NBSAPs, among others. This is just some of the recommendations: the equal participation, capacity building, access to finance, gender and equal transition. I'll give you, as I finish, some strange response. So there was a meeting at the UN where it was about the biodiversity CBD, and SEJAD, working on issues of chemicals, applied to be part of that meeting. And the response that I got is that we could not demonstrate to be accredited on the work that links with the issue of biodiversity, the chemicals that we are doing. So you find this kind of silo approach very even need to change even at the levels of such a sector, so that we have more this multi-sectoral and multifaceted approach across all government, so that the solutions can be holistic, and that can help us to implement the gender, gender mainstreaming and issues of gender action. Thank you.
Very, very much questions. And if you want to find also the report, you can scan the QR code, and it's also on the BRS website. Wonderful. Are there any one or two short questions before we continue with ILO? Yes. Go ahead. The colleague from Egypt. Yes.
Okay, yeah, really thanks for all presentations. It's very good. I have one question. It's near to Steffi because she talked about the environmental pollution, how it goes really from your experience, how we convince our decision maker, our community, that the deterioration of the environment, it costs a lot of money. If you want to make remediation or rehabilitation, it's more than you prevent from the source. The diseases case, it costs too much. This one question. The other one, we need to understand how we can deal with sometimes, like in 2015, they said for us in the COP that some pesticide is banned. And I came as a focal point. I'm very happy that Egypt banned. and we use another alternatives. After I come and I said that we banned this pesticide, we are happy. They said for me, the other one is a study, a lot of research, and it pops. How we can deal with that? Thank you.
There's a question, I think, also of substitution with another bad pesticide, yeah?
Yeah. The alternatives, it's
Yes.
the alternatives, and then after a year,
Yeah.
يعني many years, it become pops.
Would you
The
mind if
same.
we keep these two questions, because I think they're more for the general discussion, and some people have to leave to contact
Okay.
groups. So if you don't mind, I would like to ask for the last presentation from the two colleagues from the ILO. So we have Auska Grasik and we have Clarissa Macanero Viana. What a beautiful name. And so, yeah, you have a PowerPoint as well.
We do.
So let's get the PowerPoint online and hear from you about the occupational exposure side. Thank you so much. Go ahead, whoever is going first.
Thank you, Sasha. I'll go first. Thank you for the introduction. Well, I'm really happy to see already that we had many discussions about occupational exposures. So I think that's really important to start on that, very rarely are exposures fully broken down by only environmental and only occupational, right? The right to a safe and clean environment very much overlaps with the right to a safe and healthy working environment, which is a fundamental principle and right at work at the ILO. So it's something to keep in mind as we keep talking about this today. So a brief introduction to the ILO. The ILO is a specialized UN agency. It's the oldest. It's been around since 1919, so more than 100 years. And already in 1919, we had international labor standards that were legally binding that were specific to the protection of female workers in factories. So already in 1919. So it has been at the forefront of the labor agenda because of discriminatory exposures, because of health impacts, because of all the things that were already discussed today. And so I also want to make this link. Marcos was talking about the crisis that people are facing around the world because of chemical exposure. The ILO has also recognized that workers' exposures to chemical hazards are a global health crisis. We know that around the world, there's more than 1 million workers every year that lose their lives just to chemical exposures alone. That's about one worker every 30 seconds. And we know that that number is highly underestimated. We know that there's many more. Informal sectors, lack of reporting, we know that the number is absolutely astronomical. And that's something that is really leading the work of the ILO when it comes to standard setting and implementation of the standards. So let's get into the question about gender and what that looks like vis-a-vis those figures that I showed you. I already mentioned that since the beginning, the ILO has been dealing with gender issues when it comes to exposures. Now, here it's very important to consider that when we're talking about gender equality, we're talking about not the right only to work, but we're talking about the right to a safe and healthy working environment. And so this is where we must recognize that both male and female workers need to be protected in the most appropriate ways according to their exposure scenarios and according also to the potential health outcomes. So here I want to break it down a little bit because we've been talking about exposures and health outcomes. The first part to look at is the differences of gender when it comes to exposure considerations. So just looking at purely exposures, what do we know? And the ILO has data from national statistical offices worldwide from its 187 member states, and that shows the breakdown by gender of who is participating in what tasks. A lot of these we already discussed today. So things like health and care work, beauty and salon work where workers are exposed to many chemicals. Textiles and garments. Here we know that there's almost 80% of female workers working in this sector. So here we're being exposed to solvents, to carcinogenic dyes, synthetic fibers, and it's a majority women. And so here we see also discriminant exposure scenarios, right? And it's not only about the health outcomes. We have issues related to agriculture that was mentioned, the high degree of informality, and the links between higher exposures because women traditionally may lack information about the dangers of pesticides, the inability to read all labels, and also very importantly, the lack of personal protective equipment that is not suited for the female body. And so here we see differences in exposures because of lack of adequate personal protection equipment. Electronics, of course, we mentioned that, Marcos mentioned that, and also the end of electronics use and e-waste and waste collection that was mentioned by Griffins. So here we see the differences in exposure scenarios for women. And already mentioned as well was the health impact consideration. So now the impact of physiological and hormonal differences that create specific susceptibilities to the effects of different types of chemicals. And we know that female workers are at a particularly high risk during their childbearing years, during pregnancy, and of course, the impacts to their unborn fetuses. Now here, there was an important point raised also about male worker exposures, of course. I mean, we're talking about endocrine disrupting chemicals. We're talking about chemicals that impact hormonal systems, that disrupt hormonal systems. So also male workers, we're looking at infertility, reproductive problems for male workers in differentiated sectors. So this is not a biased lens. This is a gender-specific lens that looks at the different types of health outcomes based on gender. And so we already mentioned some of those categories. Now, I just want to touch on occupational cancers, because when I talked about the 1 million workers that die every year, we know that a disproportionate amount of workers are dying because of diseases. So of course, we have injuries, acute poisonings. We have things that happen immediately. Fatal injuries, but a large proportion of the deaths are due to long-term diseases that might have long latency periods. That makes it very difficult to link the exposure to the specific health outcome. And we know that a lot of occupational cancers, we've done a lot of work on this. We have our own convention dedicated only to occupational carcinogens, that women are affected at a higher rate. And we have many different case studies to highlight this. Not enough time here to get into them, but one important one that also sees the intersection with climate change is the new studies that are coming out showing female firefighters that are impacted by different types of chemical exposures from firefighting foams, but also particulate matter and chemical components in the particulate matter, and much higher rates of cancers in this working population. So we have a lot of different case studies. Now, I showed you the toxicological perspective here. We have a lot of evidence and research and data into this, but now also what are we doing? What are some of the ways that the ILO works to prevent these exposures? And that's usually on our normative framework side. So I'll pass it over to my colleague Clarissa to detail that. Thank you.
Hashka, thank you for the invitation to participate in this event. And as Hashka mentioned, we here established what is the problem that we are dealing with when it comes to gender and exposure to chemicals. And one of the ways that the ILO adopts to address these problems is through our normative framework. So the ILO, since its inception there in 1919, so over 100 years ago, adopts conventions, protocols, and recommendations. Those are the three main normative standards that we have in order to address issues related to the world of work. The conventions and the protocols are binding instruments. So those are instruments that once the country, the member states ratify, they need to observe. And then we have a committee of experts that is dedicated to assess whether this is being applied or not. And we have the recommendations, which are non-binding instruments. And in both cases, we have gender aspects that I think is interesting for us to highlight. And to begin to talk about that, I wanted to address this in a historical perspective, which is not only interesting, but also it's relevant to the conclusions that we're going to draw. So right when the ILO was created, we already had instruments that dealt with the gender aspect. So we had the Maternity Protection Convention from 1919, we had the Night Work Women Convention, the lead poisoning recommendation, and the Underground Work Convention. And those instruments, there from the beginning of our history, already shows that this was a topic of concern. And this stems from what was the legislative approach back then in countries' legislation. So we had what we call the Factory era, the Factory Act era, which was this period when countries started to have legislation on occupational safety and health. And the issue of protecting women, protecting young people was a main topic of concern. So we had these instruments that dealt with this topic, understanding that this was an issue that was arising in the member states. The problem is that we have these approaches are that they brought blanket bans often to the work of women with specific chemicals. So for instance, the lead poisoning recommendation, and we also have the white lead convention, which is a binding instrument also from actually 1921. And both of those instruments establish that women should not work with lead and lead compounds. So they should be prohibited to work in these sectors. And we have also these instruments that prohibited night work for women as well. So we have this approach that was the blanket ban approach. And even though this had a concern with the reproductive health of women underneath these measures, in the end, they were considered to be discriminatory, because if you prohibit women from working in entire sectors, you first of all ignore men's risk to the agents, the hazardous agents that are in the workplace. And now we understand that the reproductive risks are not restricted to women, but also apply to men's reproductive health. You restrict women's opportunities to certain works, to certain sectors, and you reinforce a gender inequality in the moment that this exclude women from certain sectors of the paid workforce, and therefore you tend to increase the gender inequality. So this is an approach that is considered nowadays problematic. Most of these instruments are no longer in force. The conventions either were abrogated or under discussion to be revised, and the recommendations were also withdrawn. So this is an approach that was adopted at first, and that no longer is in practice when it comes to the ILO framework. Then we have a second moment, which is the moment that focus on targeted prohibitions. So understanding that prohibiting all women from working in specific economic sectors is discriminatory, the answer that was adopted in this specific case in the benzene instruments, both the benzene convention and recommendation, was to prohibit the work of pregnant and nursing women to work with benzene products, benzene compounds, and processes involving benzene. And the challenge here is that is to balance the idea of equality of treatment between women and men, but also protecting these women that are, of course, more vulnerable to this type of hazardous chemicals. So this was the approach that was adopted there in 1971 by the ILO. These instruments are still in force, although they are being also currently revised. And we have the approach that is the current approach, the approach that is understood to be more adequate to the situation, which is a risk-based approach. So it's targeted not to prohibit, it's not focused on bans. Instead, it focuses on individualized protections based on risk assessments. And this is an important aspect when we're talking about hazardous chemicals and the risks that are presented by them, is to have risk assessments to analyze what the work situation is, what that specific individual worker is exposed to, what is the work process that this person is working in, and then understand what is the best solution. And here, we are not prohibiting women from, either pregnant women or nursing women, from working with these products. Instead, we give them the right to refuse to work in these hazardous occupations. So employers are encouraged then to assess the workplace risks and adapt the working conditions. And workers are given the agency and autonomy to also decide on that, because the idea is that the risks are eliminated and minimized as much as possible to all workers. So in this sense, workers should also have a say on that. And in this sense, the Maternity Protection Convention, which is not a convention specific to occupational safety and health, but it also approaches this topic, establishing that women, it does not prohibit the employment of pregnant or nursing women, but it stipulates that they should not be obliged to perform work that poses a significant risk to their health or that of their child. And in that same sense, the Maternity Protection Recommendation, that is a non-binding instrument that is linked to this convention, lists alternative measures that countries can adopt when women decide not to work in these hazardous processes. So some of the measures that it lists is the transfer to another post without loss of pay and paid leave when such transfer is not feasible. So these are some measures that the countries can adopt when women decide to not work in that specific work. And when it comes to the analysis of how these instruments are being applied in the countries, in our member states, the committee of experts that I mentioned, that is this committee that analyzes the application of the ILO instruments, they stated that blanket bans are viewed with concern as restrictions to the employment of women are contrary to the principle of equality, of opportunity, and treatment for men and women. Because even though at the ILO, we no longer adopt this approach, many countries still have blanket bans on women to work with specific chemicals. So this is an approach that still persists in a significant number of countries. So that's why the Committee of Experts is manifesting that this approach should not be the adopted one because of the concern with discrimination. And when it comes to the second category of prohibition of pregnant and nursing women, the Committee of Experts understands that where lists of works that women, pregnant and nursing women are prohibited to work are established, they should be regularly updated and take into consideration modern technologies that may mitigate them. Because the idea here is to avoid stereotypical ideas of what is harmful to a pregnant or nursing women, to rely actually on science to have this type of analysis. Because whenever we talk about gender and OSH, this is an important topic to mention. We have a lot of assumptions about what could be hazardous or not, and these are often set in this idea that women are more fragile, that women should not be exposed to certain hazardous situations just because they're women, and therefore this is a consideration that should not be predominant nowadays. And when it comes to the third approach, the risk-based approach, the right to refuse to perform dangerous or unhealthy work must be accompanied by other measures to ensure informed consents and no income loss. So it's about ensuring that these women actually have the possibility to refuse work without fear of retaliation, without fear of loss of income, without the fear of being put in a worse position when they come back, for instance, from the maternity leave. So those are all concerns that the ILO have to make sure that these women actually have the work right to a healthy and safe work environment. And just to finalize, because this was something that was mentioned here quite often, and it is very important, it's about the informal economy, which I think is a sector that presents an increased risk for women when it comes to chemical exposure. And it is also a concern of the ILO because we know that in a lot of countries, the OSH legislation ends up not applying to the informal economy. And this is a sector where we have a large part of the risks happening. So because of that, we have the Convention 155, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Convention. It is one of the fundamental one of the fundamental ILO conventions, and it establishes a basic framework on occupational safety and health. And that convention mentions that all workers should be encompassed by its provisions. So the idea is to also extend the coverage to workers that are not in a traditional employment situation, traditional employment relationship. And here, this I think fits a lot into what we were mentioning, for instance, about waste pickers that are usually in the informal economy. We have the situation of domestic workers that are also largely in the informal economy, basically everywhere in the world, and that are also exposed to chemical hazards. So these would be some of the ways that the ILO is addressing this issue on our instruments. Of course, we have a lot of programs and projects that are that derive from these instruments, but I think this would be an overview of what we have today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clarissa and Halska. Very, very interesting. We are sort of at the end of our time, but I would like very much for everybody to stay so we can still ask a few questions. And before we do that, we also have a representative from Mexico here. Maria wanted to say a few words about your approach as well. Would you like still to do that?
Sure. I mean, I'll be extremely brief. I was invited by IPEN to join this side event.
Yes.
Mexico champions this agenda very much. We are very much on board. Although, and I think everything that has been said here, in a country with 130 million people and 2 million square kilometers, everything happens there. So we have problems with the maquiladoras in the north. We have problems with the agricultural workers. We have problems with the waste management, etc. I will not go into everything that Mexico does or the challenges that we face. I will only point to an initiative that was created during the negotiation of the Global Framework on Chemicals that together with Germany we have, which is a Gender and Chemicals Partnership. We have a side event on Friday at 1:15 to showcase the partnership, and we are there together with Germany and with many other stakeholders. And the important part about this partnership is that it's multi-stakeholder. And we decided to join. So we have academic institutions, UN institutions, even individuals, associations of industries. And I think what is important about that is that it actually brings the conversation to where you want it to go, to really bring the policy, confront the policy with the reality. It's only starting. I think it's the next leg of the journey if we are actually going to translate everything into benefits for people and into a change in mindset and in policy. So yeah, just an invitation for everyone to join the side event, but also to take a look. I have information on the partnership and to join. It's for everyone to join to make it really to construct a breadth of support for this type of initiatives. So we can actually see in reality our resolutions, our decisions, our legislation, our policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Good. Those who need to leave, if you have 1 or 2 or 3 more minutes, I would still really like to open the floor for any questions or comments. We have your question from Egypt, so this was 2 points. And I take 1, 2, 3, 4 more hands, and we do a quick round. Yes? Okay, I'll start over here. Please introduce yourself.
Good evening, everyone. Sue Longley, and I work for the Global Union Federation, the IUF.
Yeah, come a bit closer.
Sorry, yes, I'll let lot have gone. So we represent workers in agriculture, food processing and hospitality. And I would say workers in all our sectors are exposed to toxic chemicals, but in particular agriculture. When we started, you asked us who was in an NGO, who was in civil society, who was in the UN. But I think one category was missing, who is an employer or who isn't an employers association.
Yeah.
Because for us, in the workplace, we're really trying to raise this issue, gender proofing our occupational health and safety policies. We have a whole policy on making women visible in occupational safety and health. But the tool to implement it, in addition to the work in the ILO and with governments, is through risk assessments, through collective bargaining. And that's really what we try to build the capacity of our affiliates to do. Now, many of the sectors we've heard about are going to be dominated by multinational enterprises, big employers. Many of those will have selling policies to attract women as consumers. But in our experience, they show little to no responsibility for the women in their supply chains. So what can we do? Sometimes I think we preach to the choir. We're all here because we believe in this issue. But how do we broaden the discussion? How do we put responsibility on employers? How do we use the due diligence opportunities maybe, but to make sure that employers take responsibility for workers' occupational health and safety, and in particular address the vulnerability of women, which is such an important part of the workforce in hospitality and agriculture and a number of other sectors that we've discussed. So I just wanted to address that to the panel. Thanks.
That's one.
Thank you very much for that question. And it links very much, I think, also to the presentation from ILO. But we have a few other questions. So I had over here, the lady over here. Yes.
My name is Katie. I'm from Children Zero Waste, and our organization is working on chemicals in products. So we do tests on accessories, cosmetics, and also we work with a domestic worker organization and help them to identify chemicals in their daily works. And also, the question is from our observation because the domestic worker organization tried to teach the domestic workers to use homemade tools to make soaps, dish soaps, to replace this kind of chemical products. But the employers are not satisfied with them because they didn't go through the certification system like the marketing regulations. So my question is like how to ensure this kind of grassroots innovations to be recognized within this more institutionalized society.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I like the example of the domestic workers and the going away from chemical detergents, etc., to more the whatever locally made healthy products. Yeah, we had some questions over here. Yes, the sir William.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. My apologies, I have a flu. The community have been killing me a little bit. So I have a question to specifically the team from ILO. Thank you very much for the presentation. All the panel was amazing. My question is that as a young researcher, that's the work that I do. Last year, when I was doing research on agrochemicals, one thing that I discovered in Kenya, because agriculture is our largest economic activity and farming is the largest employer by sector, you find that young smallholder farmers do not even know of the effects of using carbosulfan, for example. And most young smallholder farmers are women. And we know that the occupational safety health laws in Africa, not just in Kenya, but probably exception South Africa and probably the northern countries, have an issue whereby they do not recognize informal employment within the occupational safety health laws. So I don't know what is one area that ILO is working to ensure that those protections are enhanced, but also, is it possible for these communities to be able to take action under international law against companies that produce these chemicals because they do not provide enough information? Like the jargon is really scientific. You never know what this chemical is about and what's uses. So do they also have the right to take, or are there any avenues that they can pursue through international law to get to that? And also my last question, sorry, I'm taking a lot of time. My last question to the team Griffins and Sonia. Based on the experiences that you've had in the field, there's a lot of talk around restorative justice when it comes to communities that have been impacted. But then now with the war against gender globally, it's been happening, you see, and now the re-identification of climate change. Do you think that is an avenue that should be pursued as environmental justice, like trying to get reparations, or are there other solutions or alternatives that should be pursued based on the current political framework that we have? Because you know what's happening in the world. I don't need to go into details. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think these are maybe for the time being enough questions. And probably the last questions, but we can take it outside for further discussion. So I open the floor and we'll start with the colleagues from ILO because I think a lot of the questions were for you.
There are many questions. Thank you. Yeah, and there's, I think, a lot of different things we can say. But I think that very much to the point of Sue is there are responsible actors here. And it's true that sometimes we are speaking to only like-minded, right? And so it's critical to remember that the ILO also represents different constituents and we need to have workers on board. We need them at the table with the workers and the ministries of labor. And it's only through that can we really have social dialogue that results in something that's meaningful, that is adopted at the workplace level and along those supply chains, because that's the big divide right now when it comes to occupational safety and health and chemical exposures is, are we talking about really multinationals? Are we talking about the informal sector? And how can we make sure we have a tailored approach that works when it's implemented at the regional and national level? And I'll just quickly say something about the informal workers in the agricultural sector and what the ILO is doing. First of all, I think it's critical that we are promoting tools that are not only implemented by governments, of course, not only international labor standards, but looking at what are the provisions in those standards that relate to the workplace, even at the informal sector. So things like classification and labeling, the responsibility of the government to have classification systems, but also the employer to have labeling systems, even if it's an informal sector. If we have these pesticides moving along the supply chain, making sure that we have in transport, in movement to different types of containers, things like the globally harmonized system that applies, and we have labeling there. I know it's like something that is difficult always to implement at the informal level, but that's also why we have another level of at the ILO is the work that we do on training of farmers, of different kinds of agricultural workers. Even in the informal sector, we have 2 products called Wind and Wise that are specifically for community-based practice. A lot of train the trainer events where we can have different types of agricultural populations and also informal workers that have exposure and have their awareness raising, right? They understand what it is and then can pass it on. So there are different ways to approach this, and I think it's something we have to work on together going forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Then we also had two questions, I think, for Sonia and for Griffins. I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, I wanted to try and respond to that in terms of reparation and which you call maybe remediation. So of course, it's very kind of challenging in countries that have a lot of, hotspots, which has a lot of contamination. If you look at the international law, I think with IPEN, we pushed, for instance, in mercury, what we call contaminated site guidance, and also, issues to do with remediation. Financing it itself was very challenging, because then you look at where do you put the resources at prevention or cleaning what's already a big challenge. But there are some case examples in Kenya where we had the ChemOps project. What we did was to identify some of the hotspots, like identified obsolete containers for pesticide, which is a site around Kitengela, which had a lot of problems in terms of communities there. So that project identified some of these hotspots, and it tried by using science. The University of Nairobi was remediating it. So I would say you may have to inventorize what are some of these hotspots, but the focus is the new ways we are doing things in terms of extended producer responsibility. Also, I would want to say that I missed policies create enabling environment. So for instance, in countries like in developing countries where price is very sensitive, we've seen that our policies sometimes do not favor these alternative solutions. It becomes very challenging, even in terms of levies. You want to create a solution, but you have to go through a very bureaucratic process. Taxes do not allow you to do that. It's very easy for you to go informal than formal, because then just the policy doesn't create an enabling environment. And because it's very price sensitive in economies like in Kenya or Africa. So we've championed like in tools like environmental impact assessments that we have in our laws. They are planning tools. How do we ensure that when we create companies, the decommissioning plan, which is part of EIA, is not just a tool, but you have to ensure that you have a decommissioning plan that can be implemented so that when that program or company exits, this site can be remediated and all. There's an ongoing litigation, I guess you know, of the Winauru case, which has been long. And of course, now it has been court said that it has to be cleaned, and there's an effort to do it, but it's costly perhaps. And so we need to create policies that are more preventive, because we are in net importing economies. We import a lot of products, chemicals and all that. So I would say that it's mixed, but there's some effort to try and do some remediation. Thank you.
Thank you for these various recommendations. Then I will ask Marcos and Steph if you have any concluding remarks based on our very interesting discussion.
Very briefly, thank you very much, Sasha, and thank you for the question. So on the question of the legal accountability of the exporter of a pesticide in respect of harm suffered by somebody in the fields in the south, this question really rests on the possibility of establishing a link on the duty of care between the producer/exporter and such person. That is a very hard thing to do. But evolving notions of due diligence can move in that direction. So leave it at that. Secondly, and finally, my predecessor in the mandate put forward to the Human Rights Council a set of principles on workers and toxics. And so to echo Sonia's words, that helps us to move towards, instead of a risk-based approach, towards a rights-based approach.
Thank you, Marcos.
Yes, thank you very much. The discussion now already shows the different perspectives, the complexity of the issue. Here we are for the Stockholm Convention, for the Rotterdam Convention, and so for the Basel Convention. Rotterdam is for information exchange, and Stockholm for phasing out of very persistent substances, and Basel for wastes. But we have many further problems. We have many aspects. We have a whole range of chemicals used in our daily life, in agriculture, in our working realities. And all these chemicals have to be managed in a proper, sound way. We will not solve all of our problems to list more and more POPs. We have the risk to go into regrettable substitutions with other chemicals which are hazardous as well, and you have no information on that. What we need is a larger system, and our hope was that we can get such a system with a global framework on chemicals. Regrettably, there is no chemicals convention. It is a voluntary framework. And the role of the framework is, and the aim of the framework, to close all of these gaps, to implement a sound management of chemicals as a whole. But it is a hard way. We have the difficulties in implementation. We have the need for implementation in countries where the law is not implemented, where we have no institutions to implement the possible legislation for sound management of chemicals. But the real benefit of that framework is that all of the stakeholders of these sectors can work together, are obliged, not really obliged, but obliged by implementation plans to work together, to bring together the aspects, to explore the gaps and to explore how to solve the problems. It is a long way. I cannot present the solution, but we have an instrument to work together. And my hope that we can go ahead with that and come to solutions and come to implementation. And we have to explore how to leverage the finance to implementation, and we are working on that.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I'll say one final word. Listening to the very interesting move from blanket bans to individual policies, I did feel a bit sorry for these individuals who have to say no and to claim their right to not work in a polluted environment. I just think, looking at the women in the flower industry we visited in Kenya, how many of these women will say no?
Join the trade union.
Yeah, I mean, isn't the blanket ban in a way easier because you protect a much larger group of workers? But then I thought, no, what we need is a blanket, maybe not blanket, but we need to stop these highly hazardous chemicals through a legally binding convention like the Stockholm Convention.
Yeah.
We need to phase out all these highly hazardous chemicals so that even at the end of the chain, when we are an informal waste worker, we are not being killed by the pollutants.
Yeah.
So I think that is my aim here at the Stockholm Convention. Let's get everything registered which needs to be registered. Let's get rid of all these groups of persistent and toxic, carcinogenic, reproductive, EDC chemicals. And we need the chemical industry to stop using all the oil and gas as a basis. And we need to move to the bio-based, nature, environment friendly, locally sourced and locally produced alternatives. That is my wish for our work here. And I think the work everything we've heard today shows it's complex, but we can do it together. So thank you very, very much for being here today.
How are you?
Yeah, I was about.
Yeah.
Lovely.
My God.
Okay, what's your name? At first I was like, oh no. Yeah, I'm not thinking, right? So I'm not
Oh,